Hello, BookTube. This is Alan. I'm here for Friday Reads, and I've read one book, and I'm halfway through another one. But first, let me show you the books I picked up yesterday. The thrift stores here in Dallas County are opened because of the governor of Texas has went ahead and doing the phase one of opening, phase two of opening of the stores, retail stores, restaurants, barbershops. And what the governor of Texas did when this pandemic started was that he left it up to the counties to decide if they want to close or not. They want to have restrictions, close everything or not. And I think that's something that every governor of every state should have done. Just left it up to the counties because you might have a county in a state that only has like 10 COVID 19 cases, and that's all. And a couple of thousand miles away, you might have another county in the same state would have over 2,000 cases. So it doesn't make any sense to lock down the entire state. So if it that I think that was a good idea for the governor of Texas to do. And so yesterday I had to go to the store. I had to go to Walmart, and right next to the Walmart is a thrift store, charity shop, and it was open. So I went in. There's a lady there at the front door. She squirts hand sanitizer into your hand, and they have books there. So I went and looked at the books, and the first one I picked up was Bernard Cornwell's Lord Wolf. This is a continuing series on Uhtred of Vandenberg, Vandenberg, which started off with the Last Kingdom series. I'm so far behind in this series. I need to catch up. And I don't even know which one this is. This one came out, it was a HarperCollins book. This one came out in see if I can find the date here. 2018. It's the first U.S. edition. There are the list here. Let me see. 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 10. This is the 11th book, and it's called the Saxon Tales series. First one started with the Last Kingdom, the Pale Horsemen, the Lords of the North, Sword Song, the Burning Land, Death of Kings, the Pagan Lord, the Empty Throne, Wards of the Storm, the Flame Bearer, and finally this one, War of the Wolf. And so I believe I've read 8 of them, so I don't have that far much to go. The next book was that I picked up. I like fantasy, and I started liking fantasy when I first came into started reading and started looking at BookTube 6-7 years ago, and I started reading fantasy and really liked it. But I never picked this author up. This is Diana Gabaldon. This is her Outlander series, fantasy series, and it's called The Exile. Experiences James Sutton's story, and this is actually a graphic novel. And the illustrations is by Hong Nguyen. So you have a lot of graphic detail in here. And this is the graphic novel. And this book it said, I have to read you a little bit about the story. After too long of an absence, Jamie Fraser is coming home to Scotland, but not without great trepidation. Through his beloved godfather, Murtagh, promised Jamie's late parents would watch over the brass son, making good on their vow, but no easy task. There's already found fat bounty on the young exile's head, courtesy of Captain Blackjack Randall, the sadistic black British officer who crossed paths and swords with Jamie in the past. In the court of the mighty Mackenzie clan, Jamie is a pawn in the power struggle between his uncles, aged chieftain Crom, who demands his nephew's loyalty over his life, and Dougal, war chieftain of the clan Mackenzie, who sooner see Jamie put to the sword than anointed Crom's heir. This is by Ballantyne Books, and it came out in 2010. So this is the exile, this Diana Gabaldon. I read 2 books this year. I've finished one, halfway through another one. The first one I finished is they're both on ebook, and I received the free advanced reader's copy from Nick Gallery and the publisher. The first one was called Recovered. It's it's basically a story about how a person was into drugs. He was very young. He got into drugs. Got into fights. He was in prison for a long time, and then he became a Christian, but he still continued into drugs, and he had this desire to preach, but he believed God could call him to preach, but he still was involved in drugs. And it's basically it's an inspirational type story, and it reads just like an inspirational type story. If you ever read any inspirational type stories, the next book I read, and I mentioned this on my last Friday Reads, is the James Monroe biography by Tim McGrath. Tim McGrath is writes for naval magazines. He wrote 2 books on the Navy during Revolutionary War, and he wrote this book on the 5th President of the United States, James Monroe. And James Monroe's family came from Scotland, and their name used to not have the E at the end. It was Monro, and they put the E on the end. He was settled in Virginia. When he was 5 years old, James's mother turned James over to the father to rear, and so he learned how to hunt and fish and plant tobacco and be quiet. He went to a exclusive school that would cost like $25,000 at that time, a lot of money, only 25 students. And then when he was there, at 16, both of his parents died, so he became since he was the oldest, he became the heir to the plantation, tobacco plantation, where they had slaves and servants. So his uncle, his last name was Jones, had to take over while James went to William & Mary. It was there at William & Mary that the start of the American Revolution took place, and a lot of people blame the King George III, but no, the real villain in this case is the Prime Minister, Frederick North. Frederick North, excuse me, Frederick North was the Prime Minister of England, and he instituted a lot of England needed to pay for the war that they just finished, the French and Indian War, which a lot of the people in the American Revolution fought in, and so they had to pay for it. And so what they did, they had to raise money, so they put the Stamp Act, the Tea Party Act, the tax on tea, and other taxes on the colonies to pay for their war. And so what happens was when you had the Boston Tea Party, because they were upset with the tea, they were wanting to penalize Frederick North, Prime Minister, wanted to penalize the colonies. And so he had an embargo on the port. He sent some troops into there. And at that time, at the start of the American Revolution, England was fighting on 4 different continents. There was a Falkland crisis where Spain took over the Falkland Islands. There was fighting in India and fighting in Africa. I think it's the Zulus at this time of the wars. I'm not sure which one it was. But yeah, 4 different continents at the same time. And Frederick North was actually given a vote of no confidence. And so he was pushed out of as the prime minister because they didn't like the way he was doing things. So a lot of the Tories were at William & Mary, and James Monroe joined with some other groups, some other boys, to get rid of the Tory teachers that were there at William & Mary. And he had actually helped. He actually went and joined the army. So he was part of the army. He was a lieutenant. And the author describes George Washington as being an incompetent leader, that many of the generals didn't care for his leadership, as he was a person who would not react. He was too slow to react. And you see, the enemy was down. He didn't react. He didn't take charge, in other words. And there was a battle. It's called the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey, against the superior British guard at the time, called the Hussars. It's Sessians. And there was a superior British force. They were at Trenton, New Jersey, and the army, the army of the American Revolution was defeated in New York, and they were defeated at all the places. They were losing. So this was the Battle of Trenton, and James Monroe led a force, his troops charged in there and actually won the battle, even though he got shot in the shoulder. And his charge helped turn the tide of that battle, the Battle of Trenton. Afterwards, James Monroe became good friends with Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson encouraged James Monroe to go into the Continental Congress, which James Monroe did. And the Continental Congress, they tried to pass, James Monroe tried to pass something, and Thomas Jefferson said, well, this is a foolish task, because you need 9 states to pass anything, and Maryland never shows up to pass something. So you have a Continental Congress, and during this time, you had, there was other British forces that were still going on. You had the coming up from the south. In fact, one of my ancestors fought in a called Battle on Mills Creek Bridge, where they defeated the British. It was South Carolina or North Carolina, one of the two. And one of my ancestors fought in that battle. And so you had the And they finally accepted the surrender of the British forces, and you had and so James Monroe was elected to the Senate in up in it finally met in New York. The first Senate met, and it was on the second floor, and the Congress was on the first floor. And James Monroe was anti-federalist, along with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. On the opposite side, you had, also James Madison was also an anti-federalist. On the other side, you had John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. They were federalists. And so the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were always clashing. Anti-Federalist was for individual rights. And the author states that James Monroe wanted more individual rights put forth into the Constitution. That was rejected because the Anti-Federalists didn't have enough votes. There were a lot of some states, they wanted to be independent, not only from England, but also from the United States. New York wanted to take over Vermont. They didn't feel Vermont was a state, so they decided to just take it over, and it was part of New York. And so you had a lot of disagreements between the states. Excuse me. And there was an incident in which what everyone knows that the French helped the United States during the Revolutionary War with England. But also, there were two other countries. There was Spain and there was the Dutch Republic. So, because Spain helped the United States during the Revolutionary War, they felt that the United States owed them something. So this gentleman, and it's a long name, came over from Spain. It's just it's a long name. I should have wrote it down, but it's so long. Came over, and John Jay was going to make a treaty with them, with Spain, to give the land in the Mississippi all the way up to Spain on a 30-year lease and sell it to Spain for 150,000 pounds. It's a lot of money back then, but still, James Monroe was upset over that and felt that because John Jay acted without the consent of Congress, as is stated. Excuse me. And so he had tried to get this vote defeated, this treaty defeated, and it was defeated. And so John Jay, the measure was defeated. Then James Monroe, he got married, and then later on, there was another incident that took place when when after George Washington became president, Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of Treasury, and something else occurred. And this was that they found out that there was they felt that Alexander Hamilton was actually a crook, and he actually was taking money and paying this guy. He was having an affair, so he was paying off the husband of the wife that he was having an affair with, even though Alexander Hamilton was also married at the time. And Alexander Hamilton and James Monroe didn't get along at all. James Monroe since he was an anti-federalist, they wanted to get rid of him, so they shipped him off to France and this was after the uh, shortly after the French Revolution. So he was there in France as a minister to France, and during this time, John Jay again came up with a treaty, and this treaty stated, and I got it written down here, with England had a more favored nation status. It took place in 1796, and the debts would be in arbitration, and there would be the trade, and there would be continued imprisonment the American soldiers by the Royal Navy. James Monroe was upset. The French were upset. All the anti-federalists were upset. Stones were thrown at Alexander Hamilton. John Jay was burned in effigy. But in fact, the author states that the John Jay could walk by the light of his his burning, his figure burned in effigy. He could walk at night just by the light, and they didn't like it at all. And so when James Monroe came back from France, he was attacked by the anti-federalists, and James Monroe stood up at a dinner table and challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel. Later, Anthony Burr said, "Don't worry about Alexander Hamilton, I'll take care of him." James Monroe left the Senate. James Monroe was basically, according to the author, was basically a puppet at that time. They just wanted to get rid of him because he was an anti-federalist. And so they loaded George Washington loaded his cabinet up with people that were Federalists. And when John Adams became president, the gulf between the Federalists and anti-Federalists widened a lot. So you have back then you just had this. It's kind of like today when you have the Democrats and Republicans on one side, and instead of bringing them together to compromise on something, you have them divided so far they can't get anything done, which I think is a good idea, but it's all right. And yeah, and then James Monroe becomes governor of Virginia, and during this time there is the slave revolt in Haiti, where the slaves massacred the French, and so this one slave named Gabriel, he was actually a free slave. He actually wanted to kill all the whites, except for the Federalists, except for the Quakers, and except for the French. So yeah, he was going to kill all of them. So he was going to go and attack all the whites and to hold James Monroe hostage while James Monroe was governor. And during this time, and they're planning this the assault. He had this huge numbers of slaves, like 400, to attack, but a slaveholder came and warned James Monroe. He got the information from two of his slaves on the plantation, and those two slaves were sent free and had cash in hand. After James Monroe became left office as governor, Thomas Jefferson appointed him to, now president, appointed him to France to make a deal with France over Mississippi, and also try to get a deal with Spain in West Florida. Spain held West Florida. The rest of Florida was held by the United States. And so James Monroe went there to France, met with Napoleon Bonaparte, and there was two others that were there also. There was the Minister of France, Pickering, and they brokered a deal with Napoleon Bonaparte. James Monroe's wife, Eliza, and a previous time they were over in France, minister, right after the French Revolution, shortly, they went over to. She became good friends with the sister of the now Napoleon Bonaparte's wife. So you have a good connection there. So it's hell. Oh, by the way, lift this out. During the first time Monroe went over to France, he helped get the release of Thomas Paine, who was in prison, and also got the release of Madame Lafayette. Then the Marquis de Lafayette's wife was in prison, and helped them get released. So James Monroe went over to England to try to went to Spain first to get the deal with Spain to see if they could release West Florida, and then he went to England to meet with Pitt, who is now the Prime Minister at this time, and meet with the King, and he also met with a gentleman by the name of William Wilberforce. Now, William Wilberforce was spent his entire life getting rid of the slave trade, abolishing it forever. And he corresponded with James Monroe. And James Monroe said, "Oh, that's a great idea. Well, yes, we need to get rid of the slaves in America. And yes, we need to, set them free." But James Monroe, as the author points out, was walking with blinders on. He could take the blinders off, see the problem, but politically he couldn't do anything about it, so he put the blinders back on. So Wilberforce helped secure the got rid of the slavery from Sierra Leone and got it for free. Got to set those people free, and Sierra Leone became a free state. There were no slaves taken out of Sierra Leone. Later, after the coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte, in which James Monroe and his wife attended, he went back to England, and England passed the act in which abolished slavery forever, and James Monroe congratulated him, and Wilberforce told James Monroe, and I wrote this down, put a stop to this unjust traffic. Increase of the Negro slaves in America is pretty notorious living conditions and interesting subjects, because Wilberforce was interested in the living conditions and how they were treated and everything like this, and slaves were treated in America. And James Monroe congratulated Wilberforce on ending slavery and the slave trade in England. And Wilberforce left this, and the author pointed this out, and at the very end, Wilberforce said this: "Putting an end to the slave trade began at the shores of the United States, not within it." Well, that's it for the readings, and I thank you very much. Like, comment, subscribe if you wish, and have a good weekend, BookTube.